He woke up every morning to the sound of silence in a house so big that it felt like a small palace. The walls were decorated with rare paintings, the floors gleamed with marble that had traveled across continents, and the furniture was so carefully chosen that it seemed like it belonged in a museum. Yet despite all the beauty surrounding him, there was a sense of emptiness that he often ignored. He had everything anyone could dream of, but the truth was, he had never really stopped to think about what it truly meant to be happy. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, starting with a small shop and a few ideas that most people laughed at. He had fought tooth and nail to climb every rung of the ladder. Early mornings and late nights had become his companions for years, and slowly, each small step led to a bigger success. When he finally reached the top, he looked around and realized he had surpassed even his own dreams. There were companies under his name, properties in cities all over the world, an influence that many politicians and businessmen envied. People would often say that he had a golden touch, that everything he touched turned to gold. And in many ways it was true. He liked to think of himself as untouchable. Money gave him comfort, power gave him respect, and his reputation gave him confidence. But in quiet moments, when he was alone in his sprawling home, he felt something different, a small nagging thought that maybe all this was not enough. He brushed it off quickly. He had no time for doubts. There were meetings to attend, deals to make, and appearances to maintain. Doubts, he thought, were for people who had nothing. The people around him saw him as perfect, a man who had it all. His assistants were quick to respond to his every need, and even the staff seemed to treat him with a mixture of fear and admiration. But there was also a distance. It was not because he demanded it. It was because no one truly knew him. Friends were careful with words. Family was polite but cautious. And acquaintances seemed more interested in what they could gain from him than who he really was. In a way, he had created walls around himself, walls built with wealth, fame, and an unspoken rule that no one should come too close. Every day he followed a strict routine. Breakfast was usually light, eaten while scanning emails on a tablet. Meetings with executives, calls with investors, and visits to his various businesses filled his mornings. Lunch was often at private clubs where deals were discussed over expensive wine and gourmet meals. Evenings were reserved for galas, charity events, or exclusive parties where people vied for his attention. To the outside world, he was living the perfect life. To him, it was just life, busy, controlled, and unchallenging in ways he sometimes craved without admitting it. He enjoyed the finer things in life. Luxury cars lined his garage, each chosen for its performance and style. Private jets waited at nearby airports, ready to take him anywhere in the world within hours. Vacations were not simple getaways. They were meticulously planned experiences that offered exclusivity and comfort beyond imagination. Yet, despite all this, he often found himself reflecting on simpler times.
Our moments.
Before success, when ambition alone had fueled his days. There was a rawness back then, sense of purpose, that was more honest than the sophisticated life he now led. People admired him, some even idolized him. They read about him in magazines, followed his moves in business, and mimicked his style and fashion and lifestyle. To many, he was a symbol of achievement, a proof that determination and intelligence could break barriers. But fame was a double-edged sword. The admiration was often mixed with envy and resentment. Some people smiled in his presence but secretly wished for his downfall. Others were curious, always trying to peek behind the curtain to find flaws they could exploit. He understood this, of course, but it rarely bothered him. He had learned to navigate the subtle currents of social dynamics. Always keeping a step ahead, despite the constant hustle, he allowed himself small indulgences. Early morning walks along the private paths of his estate were moments of peace. He liked to watch the sun rise, casting golden light over perfectly manicured gardens. He sometimes thought about what life would have been like if he had taken different paths, made different choices, or listened to people who doubted him. But those were fleeting thoughts. In the end, he believed that his life was shaped by his own hands, and nothing could take that away. Even with all his success, he had a sharp sense of humor that he used often in public. People found him witty and charming, someone who could lighten up serious meetings with a clever comment or a playful joke. It was part of his persona, part of the image he projected to the world, a man who could handle pressure, make decisions, and still find joy in the moment. Humor was a shield, a way to make interactions smoother and more comfortable, but sometimes it also reflected a deeper side of him, one that was impatient with weakness, ignorance, or inefficiency. He believed strongly in intelligence and skill. Mediocrity irritated him, and incompetence frustrated him. He admired people who could think fast, act decisively, and achieve results. People who could keep up with his pace earned respect. Those who could not often found themselves on the sidelines. This mindset had been a key factor in his rise to power, but it also created distance between him and those around him. Not everyone could understand the pressure he carried, and not everyone wanted to try. Yet, there were rare moments when he allowed vulnerability to show. When he was alone in his study at night, with only the soft hum of air conditioning and the faint ticking of a clock, he sometimes wondered if he had lost the ability to truly connect with anyone. He had people around him, but did he have anyone who truly knew him? Someone who could look beyond the wealth, the jokes, the sharp mind, and see the person underneath. These questions were uncomfortable, and he often pushed them aside with a laugh or a business call. After all, he had no time to dwell on what could not be fixed with action. Business was his world, and he dominated it with strategy and precision. Every move was calculated. Every decision weighed for its potential outcome. Competitors respected him, sometimes feared him, and often tried to imitate him. He understood that life was a game, and he had learned the rules early. The thrill of negotiations, the satisfaction of closing deals, and the power of influence were addictive. It kept him motivated and focused, even as the demands of wealth and status grew heavier with each passing year. Despite the endless activity and public attention, he found comfort in control. He liked to plan, organize, and manage. Chaos was a weakness, and he avoided it at all costs. Every detail mattered, from the arrangement of furniture to the wording of contracts. The world around him moved according to his expectations, and when it did not, he adjusted. This control gave him confidence and security, but it also made him rigid in some ways, leaving little room for spontaneity or imperfection. In many ways, he was a man who lived in extremes. Luxury and simplicity, power and loneliness, humor and seriousness, they all existed within him, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. He thrived on challenge but craved understanding. He commanded respect but wondered about connection. He had everything he could desire, yet he often felt that something essential was missing, something that money alone could not buy. And so, as he moved through his day, greeting people with a confident smile, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and entertaining jokes in his private circles, he lived a life that many envied but few truly understood. He was at the top of the world, yet even at the summit, he had not fully discovered what it meant to be truly human, truly understood, and truly at peace. The foundation of his life was solid, but cracks were beginning to appear, tiny and almost invisible, hinting at challenges that no amount of wealth or power could easily solve. The billionaire had always enjoyed attention. He liked gatherings where people watched his every move, where laughter followed his jokes, and where admiration filled the air. One evening, he attended a private celebration hosted at one of his exclusive properties. The room was filled with executives, investors, and a few close acquaintances. The chandeliers sparkled above, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed softly in the background. The atmosphere was warm, elegant, and familiar to him. He felt at home in these spaces, was confident in his role as the center of attention. He was relaxed that night, in a rare mood to unwind. Conversations flowed, but he felt a bit bored with the usual polite exchanges. He wanted to shake things up, to make people laugh, and break the routine. His mind started wandering, thinking of witty remarks and playful jabs that would entertain his audience. Humor had always been a part of his personality, and tonight he intended to use it to lighten the mood. During the evening, one particular conversation caught his attention. An employee, someone who had been working quietly in the company for years, had made a comment about a small mistake in a project. It was innocent enough, A tiny misstep, and he barely noticed it. But in his mind, the billionaire saw an opportunity to make a joke. He smiled, readying himself to deliver a line he thought would be clever and funny. He turned to the room and made the joke. To him, it was harmless, a little playful teasing meant to amuse the guests. The punchline hit, and there was a brief moment of laughter. Some people laughed genuinely, while others smiled politely, unsure how to react. But he didn't notice the subtle shift in the room. The employee's face had changed. The smile that had been there moments ago disappeared, replaced by discomfort and silence. His eyes avoided the billionaire, and he spoke less for the rest of the evening. The billionaire, oblivious to the impact, continued with his stories and jokes. He was used to controlling the atmosphere, used to being the life of any gathering. To him, the joke was a success. He patted himself on the back silently, imagining the story being repeated later as evidence of his wit. It never occurred to him that humor could wound as easily as it could entertain. After the party, he went back to his private space, thinking about the events with satisfaction. He reviewed the evening in his mind, recalling the laughter, the drinks, and the sparkling atmosphere. Everything seemed perfect. He had entertained, charmed, and maintained his image. But somewhere in the corners of his mind, a small doubt flickered. He pushed it away, telling himself that it was silly to worry about minor reactions. Everyone had their own sensitivities. A joke was a joke after all. Meanwhile, the employee walked away quietly, feeling the sting of humiliation. No one around noticed or intervened. The joke had struck deeper than the billionaire could ever imagine. It was a reminder of the imbalance between power and vulnerability. The employee, once proud and confident, now questioned his place, his worth, and the respect he deserved. It was a subtle, quiet wound, but it had the potential to grow. This was the moment where humor crossed the line, though it would take time for the consequences to become clear. The next day, the billionaire went through his routine as usual. Breakfast, calls, meetings, and appointments filled his hours. He did not think about the previous night. The employee, however, was haunted by it. He replayed the moment in his mind, feeling embarrassed in front of colleagues, and increasingly distanced himself from interactions. The laughter that had once seemed harmless now felt like a barrier, separating him from those around him. He began to question his own value, which affected his work, his focus, and his interactions. Over the next few days, subtle changes started emerging. Some employees were quieter around the billionaire. People he had trusted to support his projects seemed distracted or distant. He noticed less engagement in meetings, polite smiles replaced by neutral expressions, and small hesitations in response to his directions. He attributed this to stress, business concerns, or mere coincidence. Yet, the seed of the joke's impact had already begun to sprout, slowly reshaping relationships. The billionaire, still confident, decided to host another event to celebrate a successful project launch. He wanted to reclaim the energy, to charm and entertain once more. During the event, he tried similar humor, cracking jokes and making playful comments. But this time, the room felt different. People laughed less, the atmosphere was more subdued, and the energy was not as vibrant as he had hoped. For the first time, he noticed a subtle distance, a barrier he could not quite explain. But he convinced himself it was just the mood of the evening. It's not a reflection of anything he had done. Weeks passed, and the small ripple of discomfort caused by the joke grew quietly. The employee avoided direct interaction, collaboration became strained, and subtle tension spread among others who had witnessed the initial incident. It was not overt or dramatic, just enough to create unease. The billionaire, consumed by business deals and external pressures, still remained unaware of the brewing impact. He believed that success and wealth could smooth over any tension. Humor, he thought, was always harmless if delivered correctly. He did not yet understand that power could amplify the effect of words, making even a simple joke a potential weapon. One afternoon, during a board meeting, the tension became slightly more noticeable. Certain members were hesitant to voice opinions, others were overly cautious in their statements. The billionaire noticed it but attributed it to caution in decision-making, not realizing that the origin was something as small and seemingly trivial as a joke. It was a subtle reminder that influence carried responsibilities, and even minor actions could create unexpected consequences. The employee, meanwhile, started confiding in a few close colleagues, sharing the discomfort and humiliation experienced after the joke. These conversations, whispered quietly, began to shape perceptions. Sympathy and concern were offered, and a sense of injustice started to form. Though no one openly challenged the billionaire yet, the undercurrent of dissatisfaction was slowly spreading. The joke, which had seemed fleeting, now had the potential to catalyze larger reactions over time. In private moments, the billionaire reflected on his humor, thinking about past events and interactions. He considered himself charming and intelligent, someone who could navigate social situations with ease. But he rarely paused to think about the deeper impact of his words on individuals, especially those without the power to respond or defend themselves. Empathy, he realized, was a skill he had neglected in favor of wit and confidence. Yet, he never fully grasped the weight of this oversight. The turning point had not yet arrived, but the stage was being set. Small fractures were appearing in relationships and loyalty. The employee's quiet withdrawal, the subtle shift in interactions, and the growing conversations about respect and dignity were forming a chain reaction that would eventually reach the billionaire. His words, meant as a fleeting joke, were beginning to echo beyond his control. The billionaire continued to operate with confidence, unaware of the quiet storm developing beneath the surface. Meetings were productive, events continued, and life on the outside seemed perfect. But the imbalance created by the joke remained, and the consequences were slowly taking shape. The humor that had once been a harmless part of his personality was transforming into a catalyst for regret. Though he would not realize it for some time, he remained focused on external achievements, wealth accumulation, and social admiration, not noticing the erosion of trust and respect that occurred quietly around him. The employee, once loyal and engaged, now operated cautiously, always aware of the potential for ridicule. Colleagues started adjusting behavior, consciously or unconsciously, creating gaps in communication and understanding. The billionaire's world, though outwardly luxurious and powerful, began to develop cracks invisible to him but palpable to those around him. And so, what had started as a simple joke, a playful comment meant to entertain, was quietly laying the foundation for one of the biggest regrets the billionaire would face in his life. At this stage, it was just a ripple, almost imperceptible. But ripples grow into waves, and waves have a way of reaching shores no one expects. The seeds of consequence had been planted, and over time, they would grow into something much larger than he could have imagined. All beginning with a single moment of humor, delivered without thought for its impact. Days turned into weeks, and the small ripple, caused by the billionaire's joke, grew quietly beneath the surface. To him, life continued as usual. Meetings, phone calls, events, and social gatherings filled his calendar. He believed that everything was under control, that his wealth, reputation, and charm would keep the world aligned exactly as he wanted. Yet, around him, subtle changes were occurring that he could not yet see. The employee who had been hurt by the joke remained distant. Each interaction was measured, cautious, and brief. He still worked diligently, but his enthusiasm had dimmed. Tasks that had once been completed with energy and pride were now approached mechanically, almost as a routine. His eyes no longer held the same spark, and his laughter had vanished. Others in the office noticed this change and began whispering in quiet corners. They did not gossip out of malice. They were concerned, unsure how to approach the situation. Some felt that the billionaire had overstepped, while others worried about the possible repercussions if the tension continued. At first, these whispers were small and contained, like faint echoes bouncing off distant walls. But human nature has a way of amplifying feelings over time. Sympathy for the employee grew, and the quiet disapproval of the billionaire's behavior began to spread. People started to question whether his jokes, which he thought were harmless, were actually appropriate. The atmosphere in meetings and workspaces subtly shifted. People were polite, But there was a distance, caution in their words and actions that had not been there before. The billionaire noticed small changes but misinterpreted them. A delayed response in a meeting was seen as caution, a neutral tone as professionalism, and subtle avoidance as busyness. He was confident that he still held control over his world, that his influence remained unchallenged. What he did not realize was that the foundation of trust and respect so critical to relationships had been quietly eroded. Humor, when combined with power, carries weight. One careless moment had set a slow-moving chain of consequences into motion. In the office, minor mistakes began to appear. The employee, though skilled and competent, had become distracted, his focus fractured by the lingering embarrassment and unease from the joke. Tasks were completed, but the quality had slipped slightly. Colleagues, trying to compensate, began to pick up the slack. It was not overtly noticeable at first, but patterns emerged over time. Meetings became quieter. Ideas were presented more cautiously. And collaboration, once natural and dynamic, felt measured and restrained. Other employees observed this shift and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Those who had once been open and expressive started second-guessing themselves. Politeness replaced enthusiasm. Smiles were polite rather than genuine. Conversations that had flowed freely were now filtered and cautious. Even small interactions in hallways or during casual office chatter carried a tone of subtle tension. The billionaire, immersed in his routine, remained unaware. To him, the environment seemed normal. To those around him, it had changed significantly. The ripple effects spread beyond the office. In social gatherings, executives and colleagues were more reserved. Laughter became measured, and admiration was tempered with caution. The billionaire noticed it occasionally, but dismissed it as mood, fatigue, or circumstance. He continued to joke, confident that his wit and charm were still effective. Yet each joke now carried hidden weight. People laughed less freely, smiled more cautiously, and sometimes avoided direct engagement. Small actions that would have gone unnoticed before now became significant indicators of discomfort. The employee, meanwhile, continued to work quietly, but also began seeking subtle ways to protect himself. He became less willing to take risks, less open in expressing ideas, and more focused on self-preservation. The motivation that had once driven him to excel under the billionaire's guidance was now clouded by anxiety and caution. Colleagues, noticing his change, sympathized but felt constrained by the hierarchy. The billionaire's position of power made direct confrontation or discussion impossible. As a result, the tension persisted and quietly strengthened. The billionaire, focused on expansion and opportunities, remained unaware of the growing divide. He attended galas, dinners, and corporate meetings, projecting confidence and success. His public image was strong, and outwardly there were no signs of trouble. Internally, however, the seed of discomfort was growing. Relationships were subtly shifting. Loyalty was quietly questioned. And the employee's withdrawal had started to influence the dynamics of the broader team. The consequences of one joke were slowly unfolding, though they were hidden from view. During this period, the billionaire also faced challenges from competitors and market pressures. He approached these with the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had fueled his rise. Business grew, deals succeeded, and his empire continued to expand. Yet, the internal environment, the people closest to him, and the culture within his organization was quietly fraying. Trust, respect, and connection, once assumed, were now fragile and unstable. Humor, which had been his tool for charm and engagement, had inadvertently become a source of disruption. Outside the workplace, the employee confided in a few trusted colleagues. He shared the discomfort, the humiliation, and the impact of the joke. These conversations, initially private, began to form a shared understanding among certain individuals. Sympathy, agreement, and quiet concern grew, creating a network of awareness that could potentially amplify the impact if not addressed. Small incidents, combined with quiet conversations, were setting the stage for larger consequences in the future. The billionaire remained confident. Believing in the resilience of his reputation and influence, He continued to joke, assuming that charm and wealth would maintain loyalty and respect. Yet, he began to notice moments of hesitation, subtle changes in behavior, and minor lapses in communication. Each incident seemed isolated and unimportant. He dismissed them, never linking them to the joke, never seeing the quiet storm that had started around him. One morning, during a board review, he noticed that a key team member was unusually quiet. A question that would normally have been answered with insight was met with hesitation. Another colleague spoke more cautiously than usual. The billionaire paused, momentarily considering the change, but quickly returned to the agenda. He rationalized it as stress or fatigue, something external and temporary. Yet, the subtle pattern of withdrawal and hesitation was growing, forming a silent barrier between him and the people whose support he relied on, the employee. Feeling isolated, began avoiding situations where he might be publicly embarrassed again. He minimized interactions, stayed in the background, and worked diligently but quietly. Others observed this behavior and adjusted their own actions accordingly. Collaboration, creativity, and spontaneous problem-solving started to decrease. The environment, once dynamic and interactive, became careful and restrained. The billionaire, immersed in the pursuit of success and recognition, remained oblivious to the shifting currents beneath the surface. As time passed, even small social interactions were affected. Politeness replaced warmth, caution replaced openness, and fear of judgment replaced confidence. The billionaire's jokes, once a source of connection, were now met with polite laughter or silence. The energy he relied on to feel in control and admired was gradually diminishing. He began to notice a subtle difference but could not understand the cause. His assumption that humor and wealth were enough to maintain influence blinded him to the underlying erosion of trust and respect. The quiet consequences of his joke continued to grow. Relationships were strained, loyalty was questioned, and communication became cautious. The employee's behavior influenced others, and small pockets of unease began to form throughout the organization. People who had once followed his lead confidently now acted with subtle hesitation. The billionaire, still unaware of the connection, continued with his daily routines, believing that life remained as controlled and predictable as ever. One evening, while reviewing reports, he noticed an unusual dip in performance metrics. Meetings that had been productive became less effective, decisions took longer, and collaboration seemed slower. He attributed it to external pressures, market conditions, or chance. What he did not see was that the foundation of these changes had begun with a single joke. The employee quietly withdrawing, and the resulting ripple of unease were now manifesting in measurable consequences. Though he was still unaware, the billionaire's confidence remained intact, but subtle signs of stress began appearing. He felt moments of irritation, unexplained frustration, and minor miscommunications. His intuition, usually sharp, occasionally faltered, yet he still believed that wealth and strategy would carry him through. He had not yet recognized that influence is fragile, that human relationships cannot be fully controlled, and that words, even in jest, can have long-lasting effects. And so, the silent consequences of one careless joke continued to unfold. Relationships, trust, and communication were slowly eroding. While the billionaire remained absorbed in his empire and his image, the humor that had once been his strength was quietly transforming into a subtle force of disruption, preparing the stage for challenges he had never anticipated. The ripple had become a wave, moving steadily toward a shore where regret would eventually arrive. The weeks stretched into months, and the subtle cracks that had begun after the joke slowly widened. At first, the billionaire could ignore the changes. Meetings still occurred, deals were still signed, and his empire continued to grow. Outwardly, his life looked perfect, but behind the scenes, the impact of his careless words was becoming impossible to overlook. The employee, whose feelings had been hurt, had quietly adjusted his work patterns. He no longer spoke up in meetings, no longer contributed ideas freely, and avoided direct interaction with the billionaire. His performance, once exemplary, showed slight but noticeable gaps. Others began to notice, and, without intending to, whispered about the situation. Sympathy for the employee grew, as well as unease about the billionaire's behavior. These small pockets of concern spread, creating a ripple effect that reached further into the organization and social circles. The billionaire, busy with his empire, still remained largely unaware. He noticed moments of hesitation in his team, minor errors, or delayed responses, but he attributed them to stress, market pressures, or simple oversight. He was confident that his wealth, reputation, and charm would maintain loyalty and performance. Yet, the foundation that had always supported his influence, trust, and respect was quietly weakening. Humor, which had once been a source of connection, had turned into a subtle disruptor of relationships. During a high-profile event, he finally saw the first visible sign of tension. Executives and colleagues who had once greeted him warmly now approached with cautious smiles. Conversations felt measured and polite rather than open and enthusiastic. The laughter he expected at his jokes was lighter, almost forced. For the first time, he sensed that something was different, though he could not yet identify what had caused it. He dismissed the unease, telling himself it was simply the mood of the evening or the weight of work on everyone's minds. In the office, small incidents began to occur more frequently. A missed deadline here, a hesitant response there, and minor miscommunications multiplied. The employee, still working quietly, had lost a part of his previous confidence. Colleagues, sympathetic yet cautious, tiptoed around potential triggers that might further upset the delicate balance. The billionaire's control, which had once seemed absolute, was subtly slipping. His empire continued to grow in numbers and influence, but the human element, the very thing that had fueled his success, was beginning to falter. The ripple of the joke reached social media and public perception, albeit indirectly. Rumors, slight criticisms, and subtle commentary started appearing in professional circles. While nothing overtly damaging occurred, small cracks in his image began to show. People whispered about the billionaire's temper or insensitivity, and the idea that wealth alone could shield a person from social scrutiny was being tested. The consequences of his humor, which had seemed trivial, were slowly becoming more tangible and harder to ignore. The employee eventually confided in a trusted colleague, sharing his experience and discomfort. This conversation, though quiet and private, spread awareness among those who had influence over decisions. Sympathy for the employee became intertwined with concern about leadership style. People began to question whether humor, when wielded by someone in a position of power, could be harmless. Subtle doubts about judgment, empathy, and emotional intelligence started forming in the minds of those around him. The billionaire, immersed in wealth and strategy, remained unaware of this growing wave of doubt at the same time. The billionaire faced increasing challenges in his business ventures. Competitors were more aggressive, negotiations more complex, and market pressures more intense. He relied on his experience and intellect to navigate these challenges, but now, the support from his team felt less reliable. Confidence in execution and collaboration, once taken for granted, required more effort. The invisible cracks in trust and loyalty, created by one careless joke, were now influencing his professional effectiveness. For the first time, he felt a subtle tension in areas where he had always felt unchallenged. He noticed small signs of resistance during high-stakes meetings. Executives who once followed his directives confidently now asked questions, requested clarification, and sometimes disagreed more openly. It was a shift, not dramatic, but meaningful, indicating that the unquestioned authority he had relied upon was no longer as solid. The billionaire, usually quick to assess situations, paused and considered these changes. He still did not connect them to the joke, but a sense of vulnerability, previously foreign to him, began to emerge. The employee, still quietly affected by the joke, found support among a few colleagues. Together they maintained professionalism, but subtly reinforced boundaries, ensuring that the billionaire's influence could not be taken for granted in the way it had once been. The ripple effect of one comment had grown into a visible undercurrent of resistance and cautious engagement. It was not rebellion, but it was a departure from blind admiration and unquestioned loyalty. The environment previously aligned with his influence now had gaps of hesitation and measured response. The billionaire, stirring private reflection, began to sense that something had shifted. Events, interactions, and professional dynamics felt slightly off. Laughter was less spontaneous, discussions more cautious, and engagement less direct. For the first time, he experienced uncertainty not in finances, deals, or markets, but in relationships, collaboration, and loyalty. The human element, which he had always assumed was stable under the weight of wealth and power, revealed itself as fragile and unpredictable. At a corporate review meeting, the tension reached a noticeable point. A major proposal, one that he had expected to be supported without question, met with hesitation and polite critique. Feedback, previously brief and affirming, now included detailed questioning and subtle challenges. The billionaire, unaccustomed to such cautious engagement, felt the first real pangs of concern. He realized that influence was not guaranteed by wealth or intellect alone. Human factors, emotion, dignity, and respect played a role far greater than he had anticipated. Simultaneously, the employee's perspective continued to spread subtly among other team members. Conversations, small but persistent, questioned the billionaire's judgment and sensitivity. While not overtly confrontational, these discussions affected morale and perception. Colleagues began to evaluate actions and decisions with a new lens. Considering the ethical and interpersonal implications more carefully, the power of one joke, initially considered harmless, was now reverberating through multiple layers of professional and social interaction. The billionaire, increasingly aware of subtle resistance, began to observe his own behavior with curiosity. He reviewed his interactions, considered his jokes, and questioned whether his style of humor had overstepped boundaries. Reflection, previously rare in his fast-paced life, became necessary as he sensed the growing disconnection. Yet, the depth of the consequences was still hidden from him. The ripple effect, quiet but powerful, had not yet reached its full magnitude. But it was undeniable. Outside professional circles, the social ripple also grew. Friends and acquaintances, who had once eagerly sought his presence and admired his charm, began to display caution. Laughter was polite, admiration measured, and conversations carefully moderated. The billionaire, while still confident in his public persona, noticed the subtle shift. For the first time, he realized that charm, wealth, and reputation could not entirely control perceptions or reactions. The human element, motion, dignity, and trust was an unpredictable force he had underestimated. One evening, in his private study, he reflected on the past months, the employees' withdrawal, the cautious engagement of colleagues, and the subtle change in social dynamics weighed on his mind. He realized that actions, even those intended as humor, could carry consequences beyond intention. Wealth and influence, while powerful, could not erase the effects of words or the impact on human relationships. The joke, meant as a fleeting moment of amusement, had quietly evolved into a source of tension and disruption. The billionaire began to feel the first hints of vulnerability. Control, previously absolute, now seemed fragile. Relationships, trust, and loyalty were no longer guaranteed. The ripple effect of one careless joke had matured into a wave, reshaping interactions and dynamics in ways he had never anticipated. Reflection, humility, and awareness were becoming necessary skills, replacing the blind confidence that had carried him for so long at this stage. The consequences were visible, though not catastrophic. The billionaire still had his wealth, influence, and empire, but the human connections that supported and amplified these assets were weakened. Collaboration, trust, and loyalty, once assumed, required attention and care. Humor, which had been his tool for charm and engagement, now demanded careful consideration. The joke, intended to entertain, had become a lesson in the unpredictable power of words and the fragility of human perception. As the billionaire navigated these subtle yet profound changes, he realized that true leadership, influence, and success required more than strategy and wealth. Empathy, awareness, and respect were critical. The human element, easily overlooked in the pursuit of success, was essential to maintaining trust and connection. The joke, once a fleeting moment, had become a powerful reminder of the responsibility inherent in influence. It was a lesson he could not ignore, a moment that marked the beginning of understanding that wealth could not shield him from the consequences of his actions. And so, the billionaire stood at a crossroads. His empire continued to thrive in numbers and external power, yet internally, subtle fractures had appeared. Relationships, trust, and loyalty were no longer taken for granted. The ripple of the joke had grown into a tangible wave, revealing that influence, respect, and human connection could not be assumed or commanded. The stage was set for the next chapter. Were these cons the billionaire had always believed that money, power, and influence could solve any problem? For years he had relied on his wealth to maintain control, charm, and authority. But in the months following that one careless joke, he began to understand that some consequences could not be erased with money, and some damage could not be fixed with power. The ripple of his words had grown into a wave that now confronted him with clarity. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as minor lapses in communication and collaboration. But over time, those lapses became more noticeable. Decisions were questioned, meetings were longer, and the energy that had once flowed effortlessly through his team now felt weighed down with caution and restraint. The billionaire, for the first time, felt uncertainty in an area he had always assumed was unshakable: human relationships. The employee, whose feelings had been hurt by the joke, continued to distance himself. His withdrawal had subtly influenced others, creating an environment where loyalty and trust were no longer automatic. Colleagues who had once been enthusiastic and supportive now measured their words in actions. The ripple had become a quiet current of doubt and unease that spread across the organization. The billionaire, observing the changes, felt a growing discomfort he could not immediately explain. Then, the consequences became more overt. A major project, one that had been planned meticulously, ran into unexpected difficulties. The employee, still affected by the earlier humiliation, was less engaged and hesitant to contribute innovative ideas. Others, noticing this, adapted their behavior in response, creating delays and miscommunications. The project faltered, and the billionaire, used to success and efficiency, began to feel frustration and surprise. For the first time, he realized that even his intellect, strategy could not fully control outcomes when human factors were involved. The ripple extended beyond the office. Business partners, investors, and even friends began to notice subtle changes in dynamics. Politeness replaced warmth, caution replaced confidence, and admiration was tempered with hesitation. The billionaire's public charm was less effective. Jokes that had once elicited laughter were met with polite smiles or silence. The social energy he had relied on was shifting, and he could no longer take it for granted. Words, it seemed, carried weight far beyond intention. In private moments, the billionaire reflected on the series of events. He considered the joke, the subtle changes, and the growing tension around him. He realized that the humor he had used to charm and connect had inadvertently caused harm. The human element, something he had underestimated, was fragile and complex. Empathy, respect, and dignity were not commodities that could be purchased. They were earned, nurtured, and maintained. The joke, once thought trivial, revealed the depth of his responsibility toward others. He attempted to repair the situation. Private apologies were made, careful conversations held, and efforts to rebuild trust initiated. Yet the process was slower than he had expected. The employee, while polite, remained cautious, and the subtle influence on colleagues persisted. Relationships that had once been fluid and effortless now required patience, understanding, and consistent effort. The billionaire understood, perhaps for the first time, that some moments leave marks that cannot be quickly erased. No matter how much wealth or influence one possesses, the billionaire also confronted his own reflections on power and control. He realized that his assumption that influence guaranteed loyalty had been flawed. Human emotions, dignity, and perception could not be dictated. The joke had been a small action, but its effects demonstrated that even minor words could ripple into significant consequences when power and sensitivity intersected. His sense of invincibility, built over years of success, was now tempered by awareness of human vulnerability. Externally, small but persistent tensions became visible. Meetings were careful and deliberate. Colleagues measured their responses, and interactions carried a cautious tone. The billionaire's instinct for control and precision remained strong, but he learned to adapt, observing behaviors, listening more attentively, and adjusting his approach to ensure that human relationships were respected. Leadership, he now realized, was not solely about authority, strategy, or wealth. It was also about empathy, understanding, and careful attention to the impact of one's words and actions. The employee, over time, regained a measure of confidence. But the dynamic had shifted. Interactions were respectful, but cautious. Other colleagues also recalibrated their engagement, influenced by the experience. The workplace, while functional and productive, had changed subtly. The energy that had once been effortless now required deliberate nurturing. The billionaire, observing these changes, recognized the long-lasting effect of a single moment. Joke delivered without full awareness of its impact. He also reflected on his personal life. Relationships outside the office, once taken for granted, showed signs of caution as well. Friends and acquaintances were polite but reserved. Social interactions required careful thought and attention. The billionaire realized that influence in personal circles was also susceptible to the effects of thoughtless words. Wealth could create access, comfort, and admiration, but it could not ensure trust, respect, or genuine connection. Words, particularly when spoken in jest, held a power that demanded mindfulness. The billionaire's confidence, previously unshakable, evolved into cautious awareness. He became more thoughtful in interactions, considering not only the intent of his words, but also the possible consequences. Humor remained part of his personality, but it was tempered with sensitivity and an understanding of the context. He recognized that influence carried responsibility, and that small moments could shape relationships in ways far beyond initial perception.